She was 34 years old and down to $11.60 when the men of Larkspur, Kansas, began to call her a fool. Her husband was 2 years in the ground. Her freight business had been stripped from her by the bank her father-in-law once trusted with his life savings. And the man who signed the papers that cast her into the street, Mayor and First National President Edgar Voss, had smiled while he did it, calling it regrettable business, nothing more. With what little remained after the auction of her wagons and her mule team, she did something the whole town found laughable. She paid $35 for the burned-out, rat-chewed shell of the old Fickett livery stable, a building so neglected that boys dared each other to spend a night inside it. She told herself she was only buying 4 walls and a roof to keep from sleeping in a church pew. She did not yet know that somewhere above her, tucked into rotted hay and forgotten timber, lay a lawman's private ledger, a record never meant to survive that would prove a man had hanged in Larkspur for a murder he never committed, and that the truth had been buried on purpose by men still walking free. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Ruth Calloway. If a story like Ruth's moves something in you, the quiet kind of courage that doesn't ask permission, we'd love to hear which part stayed with you longest. So leave it for us in the comments below. Ruth Calloway had not been born to hardship, though hardship had made a permanent home of her by the time this story finds her. She had come into Kansas territory as a girl of 9, riding in the back of her father's wagon behind a team of oxen so tired they seemed to move by memory alone. And she had grown up watching her mother stretch a pound of flour further than most women thought possible, and watching her father, a quiet blacksmith named Joseph Anders, work iron until his hands were more scar than skin. It was from him that she learned the 2 things that would carry her through everything that came after: that a thing's worth was never decided by what it looked like on the outside, and that a man's word once given was the only currency that never lost its value, no matter how the markets or the banks or the seasons turned against him. Joseph Anders had died when Ruth was 19, thrown from a green colt he had been asked to shoe against his better judgment, and in the aftermath she had learned to keep her own ledgers, mend her own harness, and speak plainly to men who expected a young woman to lower her eyes and let them do the thinking for her. She did not lower her eyes. In the 2 years between her father's death and her marriage, Ruth had kept the forge alive herself, apprenticing under a journeyman smith named Otis Farrow, who at first assumed she would tire of the bellows within a month and instead found her, by autumn, correcting his own measurements on a wagon axle. She learned to read the small tells that separated an honest trade from a cheating one, a scale set fractionally off true, a brand iron filed to blur an earlier mark, a bill of sale dated a day later than the goods had actually changed hands. And she came to understand, long before the events of this story, that fraud in a frontier town rarely announced itself with violence. It came instead in patient, paper-thin increments, a signature added here, a figure rounded there, until an entire life could be signed away by men who never once raised a hand to do it. It was a lesson she carried like a second inheritance, quieter than her father's iron, but in the years ahead every bit as useful. It was this quality, steady, unhurried, unimpressed by bluster, that had first caught the attention of Thomas Calloway, a freight hauler with an easy laugh and a stubborn sense of fairness, who married her in the spring of 1879 in a ceremony so small that the preacher had to be paid in traded labor rather than coin. Together they built the Calloway freight line into something Larkspur depended on: grain to the rail depot, mail to the outlying ranches, lumber for the new schoolhouse, and always, always honest weights on the scale. Thomas refused to pad an invoice even when other haulers did, and Ruth kept the books with a precision that made the bank tellers sigh with something like envy, because everyone in town knew that when Calloway Freight said a wagon carried 4,000 pounds, it carried 4,000 pounds and not an ounce less. They were not rich, but they were respected, and in a raw young town still finding its shape, respect was its own kind of wealth. Ruth bore 2 children in those years, a boy who did not live past his first winter and a girl, Etta, who grew sturdy and curious and fond of following her father onto the wagon seat, learning the names of the roads before she learned her letters. The Calloway house on Miller Street was small but warm, its shelves lined with the modest accumulation of a decade's careful saving, a set of good china bought one plate at a time, a quilt Ruth had pieced together from Etta's outgrown dresses, a rocking chair Thomas had built with his own hands the winter Etta was born. Neighbors came to Ruth when their own books grew tangled, trusting her arithmetic over the banks, and more than once she quietly corrected a farmer's contract before he signed away more than he owed, asking nothing in return but a jar of preserves or a morning's help with the harvest. It was, Ruth would later tell herself in her darker hours, a good life, an honest life, the kind of life a person built brick by brick with the expectation that it would still be standing when they were old. She had not yet learned how easily an honest life could be dismantled by men who had never had to build anything themselves. Men who understood that power, applied quietly and patiently, could accomplish what a gun never could, and do it while smiling and shaking your hand and calling it business. The fall began, as these things so often do, with a debt that should never have existed. In the autumn of 1884, Thomas Calloway signed a note with the First National Bank of Larkspur to purchase 2 new freight wagons and a second team, a modest loan against the steady income of a business that had never missed a payment in 5 years. The note was drawn up and signed by Edgar Voss himself, a banker who had arrived in Larkspur only 3 years before with capital nobody quite understood the origin of, and who had, in that short span, acquired the mortgage on nearly every struggling farm within 20 miles. Thomas made his payments faithfully for 11 months. Then, on a clear October morning, driving a load of grain along the county road toward the rail depot, his wagon went off the embankment above Cutter's Creek, and Thomas Calloway was found beneath it, his neck broken, his team gone missing and never recovered. The county coroner, a tired man named Dr. Amos Reyes, who owed his position to Voss's influence on the council, ruled it an accident, a startled team, a loose wheel, nothing more, and closed the matter within a week, though Ruth had walked that embankment herself and found the marks of a second wagon's wheels pressed deep into the mud beside her husband's. Wheels that led away from the scene rather than toward it, wheels no one else seemed interested in examining. Grief alone might have broken a weaker woman, but grief arrived with company. Within a month, Edgar Voss called the note due in full, citing a clause Ruth had never seen in the original paperwork, a clause that appeared, upon her frantic search through Thomas's strongbox, to have been added to the document after the fact, the ink a shade darker than the rest, the handwriting just slightly too careful. She brought this to Sheriff Wade Boone, a heavy-set man with a slow, watchful manner who had worn the star in Larkspur for nearly 15 years, and he told her, not unkindly but not helpfully either, that contract disputes were the circuit judge's business, and the circuit judge would not pass through again until spring. By spring, the bank had foreclosed on the freight line, the wagons, the harness shop, and the small frame house on Miller Street where Etta had taken her first steps. And Ruth Calloway, 34 years old, widowed and nearly penniless, stood in the dust of the county road watching strangers load her life onto other men's wagons, with only her daughter's hand in hers and $11.60 sewn into the hem of her traveling coat. Wondering how a life built so carefully could be taken apart so completely, and by men who never once raised their voices to do it. In the weeks that followed, Ruth learned the particular cruelty of a town's short memory. Families who had once relied on Calloway freight to carry their grain now crossed the street rather than meet her eye, not out of malice, she understood, but out of the plain fear that misfortune, like fever, might prove catching if they stood too close to it. She took in mending and sold what jewelry her mother had left her, and for a time she and Etta slept in the back room of the Fickett widow's boarding house, paying what little she could and owing the rest, until pride would not let her owe any longer. She wrote once, carefully, to the Territorial Land Office in Topeka, asking whether a foreclosure could be challenged on the grounds of an altered contract, and received back a form letter suggesting she retain a lawyer, a suggestion that might as well have suggested she retain a private railroad, for all the money it would have required. It was in those weeks of quiet, grinding uncertainty, not dramatic, not sudden, but wearing at her like water on stone, that Ruth first understood how completely the town's ordinary machinery of law and record-keeping could be turned against a person who had no power to compel it to work honestly on her behalf. It was old Con. Stance Fickett, a widow herself and one of the few in Larkspur who still looked Ruth in the eye rather than past her, who mentioned the livery stable, her late husband Amos's stable, empty and crumbling at the edge of town since a fire had scorched its east wall 2 winters before, and standing on land nobody wanted because rumor held that Amos Fickett, a nervous, secretive man who had died suddenly of a weak heart, had left the place cursed with debt and bad luck. The county was selling it for whatever it could get, and what it could get on the morning of the sale was $35 from Ruth Calloway, paid in full, while 3 men who had gathered to watch the sale out of idle curiosity laughed behind their hands and told each other that the widow Calloway had finally lost what little sense grief had left her. She did not care what they thought. She cared that the roof, though hold, was mostly sound, that the well out back still ran clear, and that a woman with a strong back and a blacksmith's daughter's knowledge of tools might yet turn a ruin into a living. She and Etta moved into the tack room, the only space dry enough to sleep in, and Ruth began the slow work of reclaiming the building stall by stall, clearing 2 years of moldering hay with a pitchfork borrowed from the Fickett widow, patching the east wall with salvaged lumber, and scrubbing soot from timber that had somehow refused to fully burn. It was on the 4th day, high in the hayloft, wrestling loose a section of rotted flooring that threatened to collapse under her weight, that her fork struck something that did not give like rotten wood, something hard, metal-cornered, wedged deliberately between 2 joists in a cavity that had clearly been cut and covered on purpose, not by accident of decay but by a man's hand, and recently enough that the hiding place had never been discovered by fire or time. She pried the boards free and found a small strong box, rusted at the hinges but intact, and inside it, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle and yellow, a ledger bound in cracked black leather, its pages filled with the same slow, deliberate hand, a hand she recognized within minutes of opening it, because she had watched that hand sign foreclosure witness papers not 6 months before. It was Sheriff Wade Boone's handwriting, and the ledger was not a lawman's official record. It was something else entirely. A private accounting dated back 9 years of payments made and received, of names abbreviated in a code any child could break, and of a single chilling entry near the front that made Ruth Calloway sit motionless in the dust and hay for the better part of an hour. A note dated the 17th of April, 1877, reading only that the Whitmore matter is settled, J.O. will hang for it in June as arranged. Ruth knew the name Whitmore, as did every soul in Larkspur old enough to remember it, because Caleb Whitmore's murder had been the great scandal of the town's early years, the story still told in low voices at the saloon on slow nights. Whitmore had been a rancher of modest means but stubborn independence, a man who had refused publicly and repeatedly to sell his water rights along Cutter's Creek to the syndicate of investors, then buying up the valley, investors whose silent partner, it was whispered even then but never proven, had been a young speculator new to the territory named Edgar Voss. Whitmore had been found shot dead on his own land in the spring of 1877, and within weeks a drifting stable hand named Jesse Odom, who had once worked briefly for Whitmore and quarreled with him over unpaid wages, was arrested, tried in a single afternoon before a circuit judge eager to be elsewhere, and hanged that June behind the old courthouse, protesting his innocence to a crowd that had already made up its mind. Jesse Odom had a sister, Ruth remembered now, a laundress named Delphine Odom who had left Larkspur in disgrace not long after the hanging and was rumored to still be living, decades on, in a rooming house across the county line in Millard's Crossing, having spent the better part of her life unable to find work in any town that remembered her brother's name. Ruth turned the ledger's pages with hands that would not quite stop trembling and found, entry after entry, a pattern too consistent to be coincidence. Payments of $10 and $20 made monthly for years to a man noted only as the judge, payments to Evie that grew larger around the time of Whitmore's death and then tapered off, and a final damning line dated some years later in which Boone had written to himself, as men sometimes do when a secret grows too heavy to carry alone, that he had not slept easy since the boy swung, but a debt paid was a debt paid, and Voss's money had built the schoolhouse same as anybody's. There were smaller entries too, ones that on their own might have meant nothing but that, taken together, sketched the outline of a man slowly hoed out by the thing he had done. A note about a horse bought and quietly given away because he could no longer stand the sight of it. A mention of a Sunday sermon on Judas that had left him unable to sit through the rest of the service. A single line, undated, that read only, "The boy's sister still writes to the paper sometimes. I do not read them anymore." Ruth found herself, despite everything the man had done to her own family, feeling something uncomfortably close to pity as she read it, though the feeling did not survive long against the memory of her husband's wagon wheels pressed into the mud above Cutter's Creek. It was not a confession meant for any eye but Boone's own, tucked away against the day his conscience might demand a reckoning he was too afraid to make while he lived. And yet there it sat, in the hayloft of a stable he had likely chosen because Amos Fickett, his wife's cousin, could be trusted to say nothing and had, in the end, taken the secret of its hiding place to his own grave, dying, Ruth now suspected, of more than a weak heart. The deepening of the mystery did not stop with the ledger's pages, because a document alone, however damning, was only ink on paper until it could be tied to living, breathing proof. And Ruth understood this with the same clear-eyed practicality that had once kept her freight books balanced to the penny. She began quietly to gather what corroboration she could, careful not to let word of her discovery travel before she was ready. She wrote to Delphine Odom in Millard's Crossing, a letter that took 3 attempts before she found words gentle enough to carry such news, and received in return a reply stained with what could only have been tears, along with a small bundle of items Delphine had kept for 30 years. A pay stub proving Jesse had in fact been owed wages by Whitmore rather than the reverse, as the prosecution had claimed, and a photograph of Jesse as a boy of 19, gap-toothed and grinning, nothing like the hardened killer the town had convinced itself he must have been. Ruth also called on Dr. Amos Reyes, the coroner who had ruled her husband's death an accident, and found him an old man now, plagued by illness and by a guilt he seemed almost relieved to finally set down. He admitted in a voice barely above a whisper that he had been told by Sheriff Boone, years before Thomas's death and long before hers, exactly what conclusions his official reports were expected to reach if he wished to keep his position, and that Caleb Whitmore's original autopsy notes, which he had never been permitted to make public, described a wound entirely inconsistent with the pistol Jesse Odom had supposedly carried, but perfectly consistent with a rifle of the sort Sheriff Boone himself was known to favor. Ruth also found, tucked loose inside the ledger's back cover, a torn half of a promissory note bearing Edgar Voss's own signature dated days before Whitmore's death, promising payment for removal of the water dispute, language vague enough to have meant anything in a courtroom, but damning enough, alongside everything else, to leave no honest mind in doubt. Piece by piece, the shape of it became clear to her. Edgar Voss had wanted Whitmore's water rights and had been unwilling to wait for a legal sale that might never come. Wade Boone, then a young deputy hungry for advancement and already indebted to Voss for a loan on his own modest ranch, had done what was asked of him and then arranged, with a corrupt judge's cooperation, for an innocent drifter to hang in his place. And the syndicate's water rights, secured in the chaos and sympathy that followed Whitmore's murder, had become the foundation of the very fortune Voss now used to strangle honest families like Ruth's own. A full generation later, the same patient cruelty, simply wearing a banker's coat instead of a gun belt. There was one more piece, and it was the piece that steadied Ruth's resolve more than any other. Folded into the ledger's final pages, she found a list of names she had not expected, a roster, in Boone's own hand, of every Larkspur family whose land or contracts had passed, in whole or in part, through Voss's hands in the years since Whitmore's death, each name followed by a small notation of what had been taken and how. Her own family's name was there, added in ink noticeably fresher than the rest, dated the same month Thomas's note had been called due, with a notation reading simply freight line, clause added per EV. It was, in its way, the final proof she needed that her husband's death and the theft of everything they had built together were not separate misfortunes but a single thread in a pattern stretching back 3 decades. A pattern that had claimed Caleb Whitmore's life, Jesse Odom's name, and now very nearly her own family's future, all to feed the same quiet, patient greed. It did not take long for word to reach the men who had the most to lose. Ruth had been careful, but Larkspur was a small town, and Dr. Reyes, frightened by his own confession, had gone straight from Ruth's stable to Edgar Voss's office. Whether from guilt or from the hope of protection, Ruth would never be certain. Within 2 days, Sheriff Boone himself rode out to the livery stable, his manner friendly on its surface but with something harder moving underneath it, and suggested almost gently that Ruth ought to consider selling the property back to the county for her own good and the girls', he said, naming a sum nearly triple what she had paid, an offer so far above the stable's worth that its true purpose was unmistakable to anyone who cared to see it. When Ruth declined, the pressure did not stay gentle for long. Within the week, the bank called in a small remaining debt Ruth had not even known still existed, a filing fee from the original foreclosure that Voss's clerk now claimed had never been settled. 2 ranchers who had begun bringing their horses to Ruth's newly reopened stable were visited separately by the sheriff's deputy, and quietly informed that the county had concerns about the building's safety that made continued patronage inadvisable. And one night, a week after that, someone set fire to a pile of loose straw against the stable's mended east wall, a fire Ruth woke to smelling and beat out herself with wet sacking before it could take hold, her hands blistered, her daughter crying in the doorway, and no one in town willing to say aloud what everyone privately understood. Etta, who was 9 that autumn, the same age Ruth herself had been when her family first came to Kansas, began waking in the night at every settling of the old timbers, and Ruth found herself, more than once, sitting up until dawn with a lantern turned low and a hay hook within reach, listening for footsteps that were not the wind. She sent Etta to stay with the Fickett widow during the worst of it, though it cost her something private and painful to let her daughter out of arm's reach, and she wrote a second letter to Judge Grother's chambers requesting an appointment, a letter she suspected, correctly, that Voss's allies at the county clerk's office would find some pretext to delay. The county newspaper, the Larkspur Sentinel, whose editor Horace Dunmore had built a modest fortune on advertising revenue from Voss's bank, declined outright to print anything Ruth brought him, calling her claims serious matters unsuited to hearsay, and suggesting, not without a trace of condescension, that a grieving widow might be forgiven for seeing conspiracy in old rumor. Isolated, threatened, and increasingly aware that Boone and Voss would not stop at arson if quieter methods failed, Ruth understood that a ledger hidden in a hayloft would do Jesse Odom's memory no good if it burned along with the stable that held it, and that the truth, to survive, would need to be carried into the light before her enemies could bury it a second time. She made her decision on a night she would later describe, when she finally told the story in full, as the clearest thinking of her life. She copied the ledger's most damning pages by hand, twice over, sealing one copy in a tin box she buried beneath the well house and giving the second to Constance Fickett for safe keeping, so that no single fire or theft could erase what she had found. She wrote again to Delphine Odom, asking her to come to Larkspur for the county fair that September, an event that drew farmers and ranchers from 3 counties and, crucially, the circuit judge himself, a newly appointed man named Elias Grother who owed Voss nothing and had a reputation, rare in that country, for genuine independence. On the fair's second afternoon, with the courthouse green crowded for the annual auction and half the county gathered within earshot, Ruth Calloway walked to the small platform where Judge Grother sat overseeing a dispute about grazing fences, and asked, in a voice that did not shake though her hands trembled at her sides, for the court's attention on a matter of grave and public importance. She laid the ledger open before him, page by page, reading the entries aloud so that no one present could later claim ignorance of what had been said. And she called Dr. Reyes forward, who, whether from courage finally found or fear of being named an accomplice, confirmed every word of what he had told her in private. She called Delphine Odom to stand beside her, an old woman now, thin and gray, holding her brother's photograph against her chest. And the crowd that had once cheered a hanging fell silent in a way Larkspur had perhaps never been silent before. Sheriff Boone, present at the fair as he was every year, went first pale and then furious, reaching at one point for the pistol at his hip before two ranchers who had lost water rights of their own to Voss's syndicate stepped quietly between him and the platform. Edgar Voss, arriving late and confident, denying everything. NG, with the smooth ease of a man who had never once been made to answer for anything, found his denials undone within the hour by the torn promissory note bearing his own unmistakable signature. A signature the bank's own clerk, called forward to compare it against the mortgage documents in his ledgers, confirmed under oath was genuine. The crowd that afternoon did something Larkspur had rarely seen it do. It stayed. Farmers who had come only to bid on breeding stock remained through the heat of the day to hear every word. And when Delphine Odom finally spoke of her brother, of the letters he had written her from the county jail insisting he had never so much as raised his voice to Caleb Whitmore, of the 30 years she had carried his name like a stone in her pocket, there was scarcely a dry eye among the ranchers and shopkeepers who had once cheered, or at least stood silent at his hanging. It was Constance Fickett, of all people, who broke the silence that followed, rising from her seat near the platform to say, in a voice that carried the length of the green, that her late husband Amos had never once been at peace in his own house, and that she understood now, finally, why. Justice, when it finally came to Larkspur, did not arrive as a single thunderclap, but as a slow and thorough unraveling, the kind that satisfied more deeply for having taken its time. Judge Grother ordered Sheriff Boone held pending a full territorial inquiry, and within a month Boone, faced with the ledger in his own hand and Dr. Reyes's sworn testimony, confessed in full, naming Voss as the architect of Whitmore's death and admitting his own part in Jesse Odom's wrongful hanging. A confession that cost him his freedom but seemed, in its way, to lift a weight he had carried silently for 30 years. Edgar Voss fled Larkspur before formal charges could be filed, taking a train east under cover of darkness. But the territorial bank examiners who followed the trail of his forged mortgage clauses found enough irregularity to strip him of his charter and his fortune both. And word reached Larkspur 18 months later that he had died, unmourned and largely forgotten, in a rented room in Kansas City. The circuit court, in a ceremony that brought tears to eyes hardened by 30 years of silence, formally exonerated Jesse Odom of Caleb Whitmore's murder. And the town, in an act of belated conscience, raised funds for a modest headstone to replace the unmarked pauper's grave where he had lain since 1877, a stone Delphine Odom herself chose the words for. He told the truth, and it was not believed. Let it be believed now. Ruth Calloway's own debts, it emerged in the examiner's audit, had been built on the same fraudulent clause used against a dozen other Larkspur families. And every one of them, farmers and freighters and widows alike, found their foreclosures reversed and their names cleared in the county record. A restoration that came too late to undo the grief already suffered but not too late to matter. The livery stable itself, the building three men had once laughed at Ruth for buying, became in time the busiest establishment in Larkspur, its stalls full, its yard ringing with the sound of honest trade, and above its wide double doors Ruth hung a small brass plate, salvaged and polished from an old harness buckle, engraved simply with the words, "Nothing here is worth less than the truth." Delphine Odom, for her part, moved back to Larkspur the following spring, taking a small room above the general store, and could often be found on fair Sundays sitting on a bench near her brother's new headstone, no longer a stranger in the town that had once condemned him, but a woman finally permitted to grieve in the open, among neighbors who had come, slowly and imperfectly, to understand what their silence had cost. It is worth remembering, as this story closes, that Ruth Calloway was 34 years old and had $11.60 to her name when she bought a ruined stable that half the town believed was worth nothing at all, cast out by a system that had decided her honesty counted for less than a banker's smile. She had no way of knowing, on that first cold morning of scrubbing soot from salvaged timber, that the very structure she was rebuilding with her own two hands had been hiding, in its rafters, the one thing powerful men had spent 30 years and one wrongful hanging trying to keep buried. But perhaps that is precisely why the truth found her rather than someone else. Because Ruth Calloway had spent her whole life being underestimated, dismissed as a grieving widow, a foolish buyer, a woman who ought to have known her place, and it was that very habit of being overlooked that let her move quietly enough and look closely enough to find what others had never been permitted near. The town of Larkspur did not owe its reckoning to a judge or a lawman or a banker's rival. It owed it to a woman nobody thought worth watching, who bought a burned-out stable for $35 and in doing so bought back a dead man's name, a sister's peace, and a town's long-buried conscience. In the years that followed, when new families passed through Larkspur and asked, as travelers always did, about the brass plate above the stable doors, the old-timers would settle into the telling the way they settled into a favorite chair. And somewhere in the retelling, embellished here, softened there, but never once untrue in what mattered, the story of Ruth Calloway would pass into the kind of local legend that towns keep not because it is remarkable, but because it is true. And because every person who ever felt themselves overlooked needed, now and again, to be reminded that the overlooked are not always wrong. Thank you for spending this time with Ruth Calloway and the story of the Larkspur Ledger. If her patience and her refusal to let a buried truth stay buried meant something to you, we would be grateful if you shared this story with someone who needs a reminder that courage doesn't always announce itself loudly. Before you go, we'll leave you with this. How many truths do you think are still waiting quietly in the places we've already decided are worthless? We'd love to hear your thoughts below. Until next time, take care of each other, and we'll see you in the next story.